August 7th, 1944, the early hours before dawn. The road from St. Barthélemy to Mortain, Normandy. 4 German panzer divisions are moving west in the darkness, nose to tail, 26,000 men and 300 tanks rolling toward the sea. The objective is Avranches, the bottleneck through which every drop of fuel and every round of ammunition feeding Patton's breakout must pass. If they cut that road, they cut the American army in half. Hitler has staked everything on this single thrust. He calls it Operation Lüttich. 700 feet above the road, on a rocky hilltop the Americans call Hill 314. 2 young lieutenants from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion are sitting in the dark with a radio. First, Lieutenant Charles Bartz commands one forward observer team. Second, Lieutenant Robert Weiss commands the other. They have spent the previous day doing something no German officer would consider remarkable. They plotted every crossroad, every tree line, and every stretch of open ground within view of their position, and assigned each one a number: emergency barrages, normal barrages, pre-planned concentrations. A grid of invisible death laid over the Norman countryside like graph paper over a photograph. The clanking of tank treads reaches them before the fog lifts. Weiss keys his radio. He cannot see the tanks yet, so he calls coordinates based on sound alone. Somewhere behind him, miles to the rear, inside a tent lit by a single bulb, a sergeant at a plotting board receives the transmission, converts the target location into firing data in seconds, and passes the solution to 12 howitzers. Shells arc into the darkness. They land among the German column. The attack has barely begun, and already the panzers are burning. For the next 5 days, while the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment holds that hilltop without food, without water, without fresh batteries for their radios, Bartz and Weiss will call fire on everything that moves below them. Captain Reynold Eriksson, the senior surviving officer on the hill, commands roughly 700 men. The Germans surround them with elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. The Panzer Grenadiers attack up the slopes, shouting, and the forward observers call the shells down almost on top of their own position. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion will fire thousands of rounds. Corps artillery will join in. When radio batteries begin to fail and medical supplies run out, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wieman, commanding the 230th, orders his men to hollow out 105mm smoke shells, remove the smoke canisters, and pack them with bandages, morphine, and plasma. They fire the medical supplies into the hilltop position like messages in a bottle delivered by cannon. The plasma is destroyed by the impact, but the bandages and morphine arrive. The guns that are killing the Germans below are also keeping the Americans on the hilltop alive. On August 12th, 5 days after the siege began, the battalion is finally relieved. Of the 700 men who started the battle on Hill 314, nearly 300 have been killed, wounded, or captured. But the German divisions that were supposed to reach the sea have instead spent 5 days dying on a road that 2 lieutenants with a radio could see from a rock. Over 100 German tanks will be abandoned in the Mortain sector. 4 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions will be wrecked, and the weapon that wrecked them is not a tank. It is not a fighter bomber, though those will come when the fog clears. It is not a mine or a bazooka or a rifle. It is a mathematical system, born in a classroom in Oklahoma 15 years before the war, operated by men with slide rules and plotting boards who never see the enemy, and directed by a lieutenant with a radio who can see nothing else. If this story matters to you, and if the men who fought deserve to be remembered, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. That is all it takes to help this channel bring these stories to the people who care about them. Here is what most people get wrong about the American Army in World War II. They think the weapon that mattered was the tank, the Sherman. 30 tons of American steel, a 75mm gun, the image that appears on every documentary thumbnail and every book cover about the war in Europe. And, in a sense, they are right. The Sherman was everywhere. The United States built nearly 50,000 of them. But the men who fought against them, the German generals and the German soldiers who faced the American army from Normandy to the Elbe, did not agree. When they were captured and interrogated, when they wrote their memoirs and their after-action reports, when they sat across the table from American intelligence officers and were asked what they feared most, they did not say the Sherman. They said the artillery. Not a specific gun, not a single weapon. They said the entire system, the speed of it, the accuracy. The way it appeared out of nowhere, without warning, landing on a position that should have been invisible, hitting with a violence that no slit trench could survive, and then stopping as suddenly as it started, leaving silence and smoke and the screaming of men who had been standing in the open 3 seconds earlier. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who lived with the infantry and wrote about what he saw, put it plainly in his book Brave Men, published in 1944. "Our artillery," he wrote. "The Germans feared it almost more than anything we had." Pyle was not given to exaggeration. He had watched men die in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, and in France. When he said the Germans feared American artillery, he was reporting what the infantry told him, what the prisoners confirmed, and what the evidence of shattered German formations made obvious to anyone who walked the ground after a barrage. General John Pershing, who had commanded the American Expeditionary Forces in the First World War, put it in terms no one could misunderstand. "The World War demonstrated the importance of field artillery," he wrote. "The majority of casualties were inflicted by the arm." Pershing was talking about 1918, but his words described 1944 even more accurately. And George Patton, in his book War as I Knew It, made the point from the other direction. "Without this teamwork," he wrote, meaning the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air, war cannot be successfully fought. Patton understood that the Sherman was a tool. The artillery was the killing machine. These were not idle words from desk officers. These were assessments from men who had watched the system work and understood what it meant. And the system they were describing was unlike anything else on any battlefield in the world in 1944. To understand why, you need to go back to a classroom in Oklahoma a decade before the shooting started. In the late 1920s, at the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, a major named Carlos Brewer took over as director of the gunnery department. Brewer was not a combat commander. He was a teacher. He had taught mathematics at West Point before coming to Sill, and he brought a mathematician's instinct to a problem that had plagued every army since the invention of indirect fire. The problem was this: artillery is most effective when concentrated. 1 battery firing at a target can suppress it. 3 batteries firing at the same target can destroy it. But in 1918 and through the 1920s, massing the fire of multiple batteries onto a single target was agonizingly slow. Each battery commander observed his own fire from his own position, adjusted his own guns by watching where his own shells landed, and communicated with higher headquarters by telephone wire that was constantly being cut by enemy fire. If a division commander wanted to concentrate all his guns on one point, he had to send orders down through multiple chains of command, each one introducing delay, and the guns would arrive on target, piecemeal, minutes or even hours apart. Brewer threw out the old method. Instead of having each battery commander adjust his own fire by line of sight, Brewer built a centralized plotting system. Every gun position was located by precise survey. Every target was identified by grid coordinate. A single fire direction center, staffed by men with plotting boards and mathematical tables, could take a target location from any observer in the field and calculate the firing data for every gun in the battalion simultaneously. The observer did not need to see the guns. The guns did not need to see the target. The fire direction center connected them with mathematics. Brewer's successor as director of gunnery, Major Orlando Ward, formalized the concept into a permanent institution, the Fire Direction Center, the FDC. Ward made the FDC the brain of every artillery battalion. 12 howitzers, whether 105mm or 155mm, all controlled from a single room of charts and slide rules. Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, the next director after Ward, further refined the system and championed its acceptance throughout the artillery community. Together with the graphical firing table developed in November 1940 by Abbott Burns at Fort Sill and the portable radio, the Fire Direction Center gave American artillery unprecedented flexibility. To understand how this worked in practice, picture the inside of a battalion FDC in Normandy, a tent or a requisitioned farmhouse. A table covered with a large firing chart pinned flat, showing the positions of every gun in the battalion, marked by precise survey. Overlaying the chart, a range deflection fan, a transparent tool that converts direction and distance into the specific settings each gun crew needs. Around the table, 3 or 4 men. One receives the radio call from the forward observer. He repeats the coordinates aloud. A second man plots the target on the chart with a grease pencil. A third uses the graphical firing table, a pre-computed chart that accounts for elevation, charge, wind, temperature, and barrel wear, to extract the firing data. The solution travels from the table to the guns by telephone wire. The entire sequence, from the observer's voice on the radio to the command "fire" at the gun line, takes under 3 minutes on a good day, under 2 minutes with a well-drilled crew. But the real power of the American system was not that a single battalion could respond in 3 minutes. It was that the system scaled upward. Each battalion FDC could be linked to a division artillery FDC. The division FDC could link to corps artillery. A forward observer, a single lieutenant with a radio crouching in a ditch 300 yards from the German line, could call a fire mission and, depending on its urgency, bring down the fire of his own battalion, his division's entire artillery, or every gun in the corps that could range the target. The American Army developed a vocabulary for this. A call for battalion fire was a Mike target, division fire was an uncle target, corps fire was a Victor target. A lieutenant on a hilltop could speak one word into his radio, and within minutes, 72 guns or more would be firing on the same grid square. No other army in the world could do this in 1944. Not the British, though their Royal Artillery was superb and had pioneered several techniques the Americans later adopted. Not the Soviets, who had more guns than anyone, but used them in pre-planned barrages rather than responsive calls for fire. And certainly not the Germans, for reasons that go far deeper than equipment, reasons that reach into the very structure of how the Wehrmacht understood war. But the system was only as good as the men at the sharp end, the forward observers. Each American infantry battalion had an artillery forward observer team embedded with it, usually a lieutenant, a radio operator carrying the SCR 610 or SCR 609 radio set, and a scout. The doctrine was almost unique among major armies. Any artillery officer at the front could call fire on any target, and any fire direction center was obliged to respond. The observer did not need permission from the infantry battalion commander. He did not need approval from his own battery commander. He saw a target, he called it, and the system answered. This meant that the forward observer was, pound for pound, the most dangerous man on the American side of the line, not because of what he carried, a radio and a pair of binoculars, but because of what he could summon. A German machine gun crew that pinned down an American rifle platoon was an annoyance until the forward observer got on the radio. Then it was dead. A German tank forming up behind a hedgerow was invisible to everyone except the observer on the high ground 400 yards away. One transmission and 12 105mm shells were on their way. The Germans learned this. They learned to identify the radio antennas. They learned to target the men who seemed to be talking rather than shooting. Forward observer casualties were among the highest of any specialty in the American Army. These men died at a rate that would have emptied most units in weeks. They kept volunteering because the men with the radios understood something that the men with the rifles already knew. The observer was the link between the infantry and the guns, and without that link, the infantry was naked. To grasp why the German army, which had arguably the finest artillery tradition in Europe, could not match what the Americans were doing, you need to understand the German system from the inside. German artillery in 1944 was technically excellent. The 105mm light field howitzer 18 was accurate and reliable. The 150mm heavy field howitzer 18 was a feared weapon. The 88mm gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, had become the most versatile weapon on the battlefield. German gun crews were superbly trained. German fire, when it came, was accurate and lethal. But the German system kept fire control at the battery level. The battery commander observed his own fire from a forward observation post, adjusted his own guns, and fought his own battery's battle. He was trained to do this well, and he often did. A single German battery, well sighted and well commanded, could be murderously effective. The problem was not the battery. The problem was the next battery over. Massing fires across battalion or regimental boundaries required coordination that flowed upward through the chain of command, from battery to battalion to regiment, each step requiring a human decision by an officer who might be in a bunker, a mile behind the front, or lying dead in a ditch. If a German regimental commander wanted to concentrate all his batteries on a single American position, he had to telephone each battery commander, describe the target, wait for each one to calculate independently, and then coordinate timing through voice commands relayed down the wire. Each battery calculated for itself. Each battery fired when it was ready. The shells arrived one battery at a time, seconds or even minutes apart. It was not that the Germans lacked the concept of massed fire. Their interwar doctrine emphasized concentration of firepower at the decisive point, and German staff officers understood the theory of combined arms as well as anyone. But the organizational machinery to make it happen quickly, the centralized FDC, the linked chain of plotting boards reaching from battalion to division to corps, simply did not exist. The doctrine said, concentrate your fires. The system said, wait your turn. There was a second problem, and it was devastating. By the autumn of 1944, the bulk of German divisional artillery on the Western Front was still horse-drawn. Not just the infantry divisions, but even some of the new Volksgrenadier divisions that formed the supporting force for Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the Ardennes. The guns themselves were excellent. The horses that pulled them could not keep pace with mechanized war. Repositioning batteries to mass fire on a new target meant limbering up, moving by road at the speed of a walking horse, unlimbering, surveying the new position, and registering the guns. By the time a German artillery regiment had repositioned to concentrate fire, the American infantry it was trying to hit had moved. The American counter-battery fire had found the old positions, and the American forward observers had already called new missions on the next objective. The Americans fought an artillery war at the speed of radio. The Germans fought one at the speed of horses. And there was a third disparity that no amount of tactical skill could overcome: ammunition. By late 1944, Allied strategic bombing had wrecked Germany's transportation network and fuel production. German batteries on the Western Front were rationed to a handful of rounds per gun per day. American batteries in the same period had functionally no limit. During the fighting at Dom Butgenbach, near Elsenborn Ridge in December 1944, the 1st Infantry Division's artillery fired roughly 10,000 rounds on a single day, December 22nd alone. 10,000 rounds. That is more ammunition in 24 hours than some German divisions received in a week. The effect was total. The 12th SS Panzer Division's grenadiers attacked across open ground into that storm of steel, and not a single one reached the American foxholes. But numbers and logistics only explain part of the story. The Americans had something else, something the Germans could hear but could not see, something that hovered above the battlefield like a mosquito that would not go away. It was a Piper Cub. The L4 Grasshopper was a militarized version of the Piper J3, the same fragile little airplane that flying clubs across America used to teach teenagers how to fly. It had a 65-horsepower engine, a fabric-covered fuselage, a top speed of about 85 miles per hour, and a ceiling of roughly 12,000 feet. It carried no bombs. It carried no guns. It carried a pilot and an observer, and that observer had a radio tuned to the artillery net. The War Department approved organic field artillery air observation in 1942, and by the time of the Normandy invasion, every American Field Artillery Battalion had 2 L4s assigned to it. Over 5,500 were built during the war. In Europe alone, more than 2,700 served with the field artillery, and nearly 900 of those were lost to enemy action or accidents. What the Grasshopper did was simple and devastating. It turned every American howitzer into a weapon with eyes above the horizon. A battery of 105mm guns has a range of roughly 7 miles. Without aerial observation, those guns can hit only what a ground observer can see, which in the hedgerow country of Normandy or the forests of the Hurtgen might be 300 yards. With a Grasshopper overhead, those same guns can hit a German battery position, a tank assembly area, a supply column, or a headquarters 5 or 6 miles behind the front, targets that no ground observer could ever spot. The pilot did not need to be a combat aviator. He needed steady hands, a clear voice, and the willingness to fly a fabric airplane at 1,000 feet over men who wanted to kill him. Major Delbert Bristol later reported in the Field Artillery Journal that 1st Army Field Artillery, air observation sections, lost 59 aircraft between June and August of 1944. and that 42 of their pilots were killed during the first 3 months of the Normandy campaign alone. Those numbers tell you everything about how dangerous the role was and how determined the Americans were to keep the system working. German soldiers came to fear the little airplane more than the fighters. A thunderbolt or a typhoon was terrifying, but it came and went. The Grasshopper circled, it loitered, it watched, and wherever it looked, the artillery followed. German troops learned to freeze when they heard the high-pitched drone of the 65-horsepower Continental, a 65 engine, to pull off roads, to hide under trees, to do anything to avoid being seen by the tiny airplane that could summon a battalion of fire with a single radio call. If you want to understand what all of these elements looked like when they combined, listen to what Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, said about Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. Cobra was the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, the operation that cracked the German line south of St. Lo and turned the war in the west from a grinding stalemate into a rout. It began with a massive carpet bombing by over 1,500 heavy bombers. But Bayerlein, in his post-war testimony preserved in the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies manuscripts, made clear that the bombing was only half the story. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he reported. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drumfire into our positions. Bayerlein used the German word Trommelfeuer, drumfire, the term reserved for the most devastating barrages of the First World War. He was comparing what the Americans did to him in 1944 to the worst that any army had ever endured. Panzer Lehr lost roughly 1,000 of its 2,200 frontline troops on that single day. The division ceased to exist as a fighting formation. What Bayerlein described was not just bombing. It was the integrated effect of strategic air power and massed artillery working together, nearly 1,000 guns in 47 artillery battalions, firing tens of thousands of rounds during the bombardment. The Grasshoppers were overhead spotting surviving anti-aircraft guns that had fired at the bombers. Artillery silenced them. The system consumed everything in its path. Now, put all of this together. The fire direction center that could mass every gun in a corps onto one target. The forward observers embedded with infantry platoons who could call fire in 3 minutes. The Grasshoppers overhead extending the observers' eyes miles behind the German line. The ammunition supply that allowed American batteries to fire without pause. And then, in December 1944, add one more element. The element that turned a devastating system into something approaching a war crime against anyone caught in the open. The proximity fuze. The VT fuze, code-named POSIT in Army service, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Developed by the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, under the direction of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, it contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver inside the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell approached the ground, the radio signal bounced off the surface and triggered detonation at a height of roughly 20 to 50 feet. The result was an airburst that sprayed shrapnel downward in a cone of killing fragments. A conventional shell with a contact fuse buries itself in the ground before exploding, which absorbs much of the blast and sends fragments upward and outward. A proximity-fused shell explodes above the ground, and every fragment travels downward into foxholes, trenches, and the bodies of men lying prone. The fuse had been used at sea since January 1943, when it proved devastating against Japanese aircraft, but the Pentagon refused to authorize it for ground combat for nearly 2 years. The fear was that an unexploded dud would land intact, be recovered by the Germans, and be reverse-engineered. Only when the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944 did Eisenhower request clearance. Restrictions were lifted on December 21st, and roughly 200,000 POSIT shells were rushed to the front. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. On the night of December 25th and 26th, 1944, Patton's Third Army caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Echternach. The artillery fired a concentration using proximity-fused shells. Patton recorded the result in his diary and in a letter to the War Department. The night of December 25th and 26th, he wrote, "We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. He went further. The funny fuse, he called it, won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. Think about what that number means. 702 men killed in a single concentration. A single fire mission, a single call from a single observer, executed by a single battalion of guns firing shells that exploded 20 feet above the ground. No tank battle in the entire war produced a casualty figure like that from one engagement, from one fire mission. The proximity fuse did not just increase the lethality of American artillery. It eliminated the last refuge of the defending soldier. A man in a foxhole had some chance against a contact-fused shell that buried itself in the dirt before exploding. He had almost no chance against a shell that detonated directly above him, driving fragments straight down into the hole he thought would save his life. German prisoners taken after proximity fuse attacks described the experience as something for which there was simply no defense. They were not exaggerating. And now go back to Elsenborn Ridge, December 1944, and see what the full system looked like when every element was working together. The German 6th Panzer Army, the strongest force Hitler could assemble, launched the main effort of the Ardennes offensive directly into the American 5th Corps sector. This was supposed to be the decisive blow. Sepp Dietrich commanded it. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, and multiple Volksgrenadier divisions would smash through the American line, seize the road network behind Elsenborn, and drive for the Meuse River crossings. If they succeeded, they would split the American and British armies and reach the port of Antwerp. That was the plan. The reality was different. The untested 99th Infantry Division and the veteran 2nd Infantry Division held the high ground along the ridge. They fought with extraordinary courage in the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt, trading fire with SS Panzer Grenadiers at ranges measured in yards, destroying German tanks with bazookas fired from second-story windows. But what made their stand possible, what turned a desperate defense into an impregnable position, was what sat behind them. Over 300 American artillery pieces were concentrated in the Corps sector, with fields of fire that covered every approach. Every American battalion FDC was linked to division. Division was linked to Corps. The entire chain was alive and waiting. The Germans attacked on December 16th, 17th, 18th, and again on the 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 26th. Each time the sequence was the same. German infantry and armor formed up in the tree line. American forward observers on the ridge spotted them. Fire missions went to the FDC. Within minutes, shells were landing among the assembling troops. When the Germans pressed forward anyway, the observers adjusted fire onto the advancing waves. Corps and division artillery joined in. The ground shook. Entire companies were caught in the open between the tree line and the American foxholes and cut to pieces before they could close the distance. On December 21st, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division attempted an attack and was hit by artillery while still forming up. The attack was cancelled before it began. On December 26th, the 246th Volksgrenadier Division made a final attempt against the 99th Division. That attack was, in the words of the official history, mowed down by artillery fire virtually at the moment of its start. The vast artillery concentration of an entire American corps made the Elsenborn Ridge position virtually unassailable. Think about what was happening here. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, the tip of the spear of the last German offensive in the west, featuring the 12th SS Panzer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, was stopped cold. Not by American tanks, not by air power, because the skies were overcast for the first week and the fighters could not fly. It was stopped by artillery, by mathematics, by a system of linked plotting boards reaching from a lieutenant on a ridgeline to a corps headquarters 20 miles behind the front, by men with slide rules calculating firing data in seconds, by shells landing with a precision and a speed that the German attackers could neither predict nor survive. The Germans felt it on every front. At Mortain, where Bartz and Weiss on Hill 314 called fire that wrecked 4 panzer divisions. At Elsenborn Ridge, where massed corps artillery turned the main German effort into a slaughter. Along the Sauer, where proximity-fused concentrations killed hundreds in a single fire mission. And in the hedgerows and in the Hurtgen and across the Rohr and over the Rhine, in every engagement where American infantry and American artillery worked together, the pattern repeated. The infantry held. The observers called, the guns fired, and the Germans died in numbers that no amount of tactical courage could sustain. Now here is the question that should stay with you, the same kind of question the German officers asked themselves in captivity after the war. Why could the finest army in Europe, the army that invented the Blitzkrieg, that built the Panzer Division, that produced officers trained in the Prussian tradition of command excellence, not build what the Americans had built? The answer is not equipment. The Germans had excellent guns, excellent optics, and excellent communications when their equipment was available. The answer is not talent. German artillerymen were among the best trained in the world. The answer is architectural. It is structural. It is about what each army believed about where intelligence should flow and who should control the guns. In the German system, the battery commander was a decision-maker. He observed, he decided, he fired. If he needed to coordinate with another battery, the request went up through the chain. The chain processed it. The chain decided. Authority rested with rank. The higher the rank, the more guns you could direct, but also the farther from the front you sat, and the slower your decisions traveled. The American system inverted this. Authority to call fire rested with the observer, the man closest to the enemy. A lieutenant with a radio could call a battalion. With one additional word, he could call a division. The FDC did not decide whether to fire. It calculated how to fire. The decision, the tactical judgment about what needed to be hit and how urgently, was made at the bottom by the man who could see the target. The system trusted his eyes. It trusted his judgment, and it responded to his voice with the full weight of every gun in range. This was not a small difference. This was a fundamentally different theory of war. The German model, said the commander at the top, synthesized information from below and directed fire from above. The American model, said the man at the bottom, saw the truth first, and the system existed to put steel where he pointed. One was an orchestra, conducted from a podium. The other was a network, activated by any node. Major General R.O. Barton, commanding the 4th Infantry Division, described it after the war in a conversation with his division artillery commander. "The artillery was my strongest tool," he said. "Often it was my only reserve. I repeatedly said it was more a matter of the infantry supporting the artillery than the artillery supporting the infantry. I wish I knew the countless times that positions were taken or held due solely to time-on-target fires. That phrase, time on target, deserves its own explanation because it represents the mathematical perfection of what Brewer and Ward had started at Fort Sill. Time on target solved a brutal problem. When multiple batteries at different distances fire at the same target, their shells arrive at different times. The battery closest to the target hits first, then the next closest, then the next. The first shells give the defenders a warning. They hear the impacts, they drop prone, and they scramble for cover. By the time the last rounds arrive, the men they were meant to kill are in their foxholes. Time on target calculates the flight time of every shell from every participating battery and staggers their firing so that every round, from every gun, from every distance, arrives within a few seconds of each other. There is no warning. There is no first shell. There is only sudden, simultaneous, total destruction. 1 second, the field is quiet. The next second, it is an inferno. The technique had been pioneered by the British Royal Artillery in North Africa in 1941 and 1942. The Americans took the concept and industrialized it through the FDC system. By 1944, a time-on-target concentration from a full corps was a weapon of annihilation. German prisoners taken after time-on-target attacks described the experience as incomprehensible. They used the word automatic. One moment there was silence. The next moment the world exploded. There was no crescendo, no build-up, and no chance to react. The rounds simply arrived, all of them, at once. And whatever had been standing in that grid square was no longer standing. The German army could not replicate this, not because it lacked talented gunners or good guns, because replicating it would have required rebuilding the entire relationship between the observer in the field and the guns behind the line. It would have required trusting a lieutenant's judgment enough to hand him the fire of an entire corps. It would have required centralizing fire control in a way that stripped battery commanders of their autonomy. It would have required building an analog computing system, the FDC network, from scratch in the middle of a war they were already losing, and it would have required something even harder, It would have required admitting that the man at the bottom of the hierarchy, the observer in the ditch, the lieutenant on the hill, knew more about where the shells needed to land than the colonel at the regimental headquarters. The German army was not built to admit that. It was built on the principle that trained officers, applying proven doctrine through disciplined command, would always produce better decisions than improvised authority at the bottom. For 5 years that principle had conquered most of Europe. But it contained an assumption that the bocage and the Ardennes and the frozen fields of the Bulge exposed for what it was. The assumption was that the commander at the top had the better picture. In a war where the battlefield changed faster than reports could travel, he did not. The man with the best picture was the one lying in the snow with a radio, watching the German infantry form up in the tree line 300 yards away, knowing that if he could get the word out in the next 30 seconds, 72 guns would answer him. The American artillery system was not a weapon. It was an expression of a belief. The belief that the man closest to the problem was the man best qualified to direct the solution. That information should flow laterally and upward, not just downward. That a system built to respond to the sergeant's eyes was worth more than a system built to execute the general's plan. That mathematics and trust, linked by radio, could multiply the killing power of a howitzer battery beyond anything the designers of those guns had ever imagined. After the war, the numbers confirmed what the men on the ground already knew. Artillery was responsible for the majority of casualties on every major front. The artillerymen who served the guns never became famous. No one made movies about the FDC. No one put a plotting board on a recruiting poster. The forward observers who died calling fire on positions they could have run from. The Grasshopper pilots who flew fabric airplanes through anti-aircraft fire to spot for batteries they would never see. The sergeants who stood at the plotting board doing trigonometry while shells landed in the next field. None of them entered the popular imagination the way tankers and paratroopers did. But the Germans knew. They knew every time a concentration landed without warning on a forming attack. They knew every time a panzer column stopped on a road because a little airplane was circling overhead, and the crews understood that where the airplane looked, the shells followed. They knew at Mortain, where 2 lieutenants on a hill called fire that stopped 4 divisions. They knew at Elsenborn Ridge, where massed corps artillery broke the main effort of the last German offensive. They knew at the Sauer River, where 702 men died in a single night under shells that exploded before they hit the ground. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz survived the war. So did Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion, a Georgia National Guard unit, had arrived in France on June 10, 1944, just 4 days after the landings. By the time they reached Hill 314 2 months later, they had already fought through the hedgerows and survived the short bombing during Operation Cobra. After Mortain, the 30th Infantry Division, which the 230th supported, went on to fight at the Siegfried Line, at the Roer, and in the Ardennes. Axis Sally, the German propaganda broadcaster, reportedly gave the 30th Division a name on air that no other American unit received. She called them Roosevelt's SS. The division's veterans carried the nickname as a badge of honor for the rest of their lives, and it was earned as much by the division's artillery as by its infantry. Major Carlos Brewer, the man who started it all in a classroom at Fort Sill, went on to command the 12th Armored Division during training. He was not permitted to lead it in combat because the army judged him too old. So he requested that his rank be reverted from Major General to Colonel, and he went to the European theatre as an artillery officer. The man who had invented the system that was winning the war asked to be demoted so he could go fight in it. Brewer was born in 1890 in Golo, Kentucky. He graduated from West Point in 1913. He died in 1976, having never written a memoir and never sought recognition for the revolution he had set in motion. His name does not appear in any popular history of the war. It should. Orlando Ward, who formalized the FDC into the institution that won 1,000 engagements, went on to command the 1st Armored Division in North Africa, before later leading the 20th Armored Division in Germany in 1945. Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, who refined the system after Ward, ensured its adoption across the entire field artillery community before the invasion of Europe. 3 men, working in a gunnery department in Oklahoma during the Depression, built the architecture that would kill more German soldiers than any tank or bomber the United States ever produced. The Fire Direction Center that Brewer and Ward built in the 1930s is still the foundation of American field artillery today. The plotting boards are gone, replaced by digital computers. The grasshoppers are gone, replaced by drones and satellites. The radios are encrypted and networked in ways that Weiss and Bartz could never have imagined. But the architecture is the same. The observer sees. The FDC calculates. The guns fire. The man closest to the enemy still directs the most powerful weapons on the battlefield. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, American infantry under fire has reached for the same tool. A radio, a voice, and the mathematical certainty that steel will arrive where it is needed within minutes. The specific weapons have changed. The calibers have grown. The ranges have extended. But the principle that a forward observer's call for fire activates the full weight of every available gun has never been abandoned, because no one has ever found anything that works better. The Germans built beautiful tanks. The Americans built a system. The tanks are in museums now. The system is still fighting. Thank you for watching this all the way through. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the men behind those guns, I would be grateful if you hit the like button. It is the single best way to help this story reach the people who care about it. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great-uncle, tell me about them in the comments. Their stories deserve to be heard. Thank you. I will see you in the next one.